cannot be harassed in our own country during apartheid and be harassed in our own country during a democratic dispensation by a nonsense Afrikaner community. It must come to an end. Let us take them toe to toe. Let us show them who is in charge of this country. This is our land. This is our country. We will defend it with everything. If it means defending it with our lives, let us defend it with our lives.
My guest is Joost Strydom, Chief Executive Officer of the Oranje Beweging.
'n Vlag is meer as net 'n stuk lap. 'n Vlag is 'n simbool van 'n volk se hoop, waardes en toekoms. Dit dra stories van die verlede, van stryd en van oorwinning. En wanneer hierdie vlag wapper, dan wapper hy in ons harte.
Welcome to the program, Joost.
Thank you very much. It's a fantastic opportunity, and it's nice to connect also with Afrikaner on that side of the world, and to, in this program, give a bit of feedback about the developments in Orania and what we are doing and why we are doing it. And I'm looking forward to a fruitful conversation.
Orania has been in the spotlight for the last couple of weeks. I've been following it as well. You've just returned from Europe. You are the executive head of Orania. The Economic Freedom Front is demanding your demise. The latest I heard was Gwedi Mantashe, who's just called on black people to go and build in Orania, I think were his words. You're a 32-year-old man, I think, 31, 32 years old, a young man, in effect the leader of Orania. How do you cope with all of this?
Well, luckily, I must say that very thankfully, I play my role at the Orania movement, but we have a broad leadership core thinking of Gawie Snyman, town manager, involved with a lot of the infrastructure and development, thinking of Frans de Klerk, a veteran of the Orania pioneers, very involved with the hard infrastructure at the Orania Development Company, and Rian Jacobs at the Orania Representative Council. We are a broad leadership core, meaning that no one single person has to take all the responsibility, but that we share the responsibility in different levels of it, and take charge in the aspects where we are responsible for. Obviously, with the very inflammatory comments that we've seen from the economic freedom fighters, claiming that the South African constitution should be changed for the sole reason to deny Orania its right to exist, and that is specifically then referring to Article 235, guaranteeing the right to cultural self-determination. Luckily then also the broad leadership structure can come together and formulate a response as responsibility takers, as co-authors with the peoples of Orania, co-authors of our story. And in that sense, we are thankful to have many institutions and so on taking responsibility. If it were to come down on one of us alone, if all the development, all the internal management, all the external political pressure were to be flushed down on a single one of us, I don't think, even Afrikaners notoriously tough, I don't think any one of us would be able to cope with all that. But luckily we are many and we are motivated, and that helps. And I think the most important, except from the grace of God above, the most important other thing is the support that we get not only from the people of Orania, but from Afrikaners around the country and around the world, supporting us. If they see the EFF wanting to mobilize against Orania, the staggering amount of support that we receive is, it's wind in our sails.
Yeah. If I remember correctly, Joost, when all of this started happening, we started hearing the rumors that the EFF is going to march on Orania. What happens? How did you deal with it? What is it? Getting phone calls all the time from South Africa? Sketch me a little bit the scenario.
Yeah. Well, it was interesting. Not only me on my own were in Europe, we were a delegation representing political, construction engineering, and educational leaders from Orania. So a lot of us were actually
a lot of the leadership, in other words, a lot of the leadership.
Yes, yes, yes. A lot of us were in Europe at that stage. Many of us, we were 9 in total, the total delegation.
Yeah.
And in that time frame, it was tremendous to see our people who remained here, also in leadership roles, but also in representing Orania in other ways, how they took up the responsibility, and we helped coordinate from that side. But our people on this side had, using the word tactical sounds very warlike, but it is, tactical ground level decision making that could happen here. Obviously, we gave our input, Gawie Snyman and Rian Jacobs and myself and others who were in Europe at that stage. But the people here took responsibility for the day-to-day things. And also with this, so we were typing up media declarations on airport terminals, and we were, taking phone calls in the cars and in the trains as we're traveling. But our people here handled it, I think, sterlingly, and we were very thankful for that. It's not the first time that things like this happens, and it's not the first time that the broad leadership from Orania and its institutions came forward and took up the rose to the challenge. So yes, we had a few late nights returning from meetings and so on in Europe, where we had to still think about media statements and think about strategy and give our input. But luckily, our people on this side were performing very, very well as well.
What happens on the inside? You're far away from home. It is obviously your beloved Urania. There is this information that's buzzing in the air of something that's going to happen. What does it feel like to go through something like this?
Yeah, it's actually the first time that anyone asked it in that way. And I think, in Afrikaans we have a saying, your huis is waar your heart is, your home is where your heart is. And I can tell you very much that in that time frame, our hearts were at home. Although we had very much confidence in the leadership structures of the people who remained in Urania and took responsibility. Every night when you go to bed, you lay there thinking about this, and you are concerned for your people and concerned for what's going on here and so on. Although you have a lot of trust, I think all of us are so fiery with this Urania idea. We need to see it. We want to see it work. We must see it work. But also, obviously, the safety of your beloved family members and your people back here is of immense importance. So, yeah, we were thinking about our people a lot, thinking about home a lot, giving insights and ideas as we can. Just to try and help. I mean, sometimes it's just a feeling that you're at least doing your part, thinking of ideas and strategies and so on. So yeah, definitely it was on the forefront of our minds all the time. Though we had trusted the people at home, we were still very concerned.
It's a huge responsibility, Joost. I can imagine people looking up to you as well. Uh, in this particular case, you're also now sitting here in Europe. I'm trying to sort of get to know you a little bit more. How how did you prepare for this role that you are in right now? You took over from Karel Boshoff, and once again, I stress the fact that you're a very young man still. But how does one prepare for something like this? How do you prepare for your role as, well, in a
I
sense, the leader of Urania?
quite even younger when I started specifically at the Iranian movement in this current role. And I remember during some of the conversations and interviews before this, someone asked me the specific question. And the only thing that I could think of was to say, well, that might be the case. But another candidate for this role would have to come into Urania and maybe a better strategist, or maybe a better media liaison person, or a better economist, or a better political advisor or thinker. And they might have many more years of experience than me in any of those or all of those. However, I've had Urania experience for all my life. I was just a small kid, a small baby actually, when we moved from that, at that stage, very unstable KwaZulu-Natal. And Orania is what I know. Orania is not the only thing I know, but it's the thing I know best in terms of my frame of reference. And with that, I do not mean better than anyone else. I mean, from all the things that I know, Orania is the thing that I know most about. Why is that? Well, growing up in Orania, being under constant scrutiny, under constant investigation, even as a small child, going to school, having to explain to journalists, to political visitors, to international visitors, to many news outlets, to people, to antagonists against Orania, constantly having to explain what Orania is, why it's necessary. That was a form of preparation, although unknowingly, in terms of trying or succeeding in explaining the Orania ideal without making more enemies. I think we as Afrikaners know what the situation in the country and in the world is, and we as Oranians know we were always vulnerable in sense of size and sense of political target of Orania, and we are not in the game of making enemies. So that was an entire childhood of preparation for this role in my mind, and that's how I tried to explain it to the people asking back then. And I hope that I could have met some of the expectations at least. No man can ever live up to, expectations of doing a perfect job, but I hope that at least I in some way influenced people positively in regards to the Orania idea. But for me personally, a lifetime of explaining my community, the community that I love, certainly helped later on when it was more formalized into a career.
Yeah, I want to explore that, what that means to you all. But I'd like to talk to you a little bit about when you were a young boy. I would then take it that you would go to a primary school in Orania and later to a secondary school. So I would imagine most of your schooling took place within Orania itself. I would imagine later at university, probably back in South Africa.
Yeah, actually, in Orania, I could see how the educational facilities developed in my time here. For a major chunk of my schooling years, my parents chose to homeschool me in very creative ways, also giving me a very broad perspective on the world by giving me the opportunity to see different settings of people's work situations. They always tried to make my life and my experience as broad as possible. And later on, I went to a normal school where I finished my high school career and then went on to study.
If you say, just let me interrupt you. If you say normal school, would that be then a normal school in South Africa and not in
Orania? In Orania. Before that, I was homeschooled in a very alternative kind of way, and later on, I went to formal schooling in Orania to complete my high school.
At what point in your life do you discover that the situation within the space within which you are growing up is not the same as, say, that of every other South African child that grows up? And contained in that question, just yours for one moment, would also be then, at what point do you start learning about the history of South Africa and the history of the space that you find yourself in? What was that like?
Well, I would say that context was given to me so early that I can't really remember anything before it. Since, moving to Orania now is one thing. Moving to Orania in 1995, so in the middle to late 90s, early 2000s, Orania was something completely different in terms of the public perception. Friends and family would think weird of you in that stage for moving to this place. Not only media institutions and things like that. So there was always the thing of explaining why. Why is this necessary? Because Orania is a very proactive project. It's not a reactive project. And because of the fact that it's a proactive project, it happened before people felt it necessary. It's easier to, and it was a lot of sacrifice in the beginning years. People came here leaving very successful careers as doctors, lawyers, professors, and so on. and came to a ghost town in which there was no functioning economy. It had to be built, very little schooling opportunities and so on. That had to be built. So sacrificing economic prosperity in the rest of South Africa to come to Orania and to come and struggle here because it was a proactive solution and not a reactive solution was very strange for people. So even in the early years, you had to explain why on earth are you doing it. So it was so early, I can't remember a specific instance where that clicked. I can remember many instances where I had to explain Orania as a very small kid, but or at least be a participant or a listener in conversations about these facts.
Yeah.
So in it all, I think it was just almost part of my DNA. It was just always the case, explaining why, explaining how it works. And very soon you get contrasted to other kids in South Africa at that stage with maybe better or more luxurious opportunities and so on, different views on politics, economics, history, whatever. So very soon you start realizing this. There's a different context, but it is something that you grow appreciation for
Yeah.
later on.
Yeah, I'm really fascinated by this. Yeah, you're a young boy. When you're 10 years old, you're not politically informed or educated. I can imagine that at that time, specifically, people, maybe even within the context of your own family, would say you're part of this bunch of crazy Afrikaners who's just left the broader South Africa and who is trying to recreate something akin to apartheid. I can imagine that those must have been some of the kind of finger wagging or accusations that you must have dealt with as a young kid. Is that so? And if so, how did you deal with that? What was your story? What was your response to that?
It's funny you ask. I mean, I think the context at that stage was not necessarily, you're right, the small kid doesn't know all those things.
Yeah.
However, one should never underestimate small children listening to adult conversations.
Mhm.
So when we settled in Orania, my father bought a piece of land, a piece of Karoo land. Now, anyone who knows the Karoo knows it's arid, dry, inhospitable, desert-like environment. We located ourselves on a plot of a few hectares. At that stage, there was the road there, which was a two-wheel wagon, two-wheel gravel road, and the only piece of infrastructure on that little farm was the four corner pins showing the exact farm. So there was no water supply, no electricity,
Yeah.
no sewage, nothing. That had to be built. So I remember many nights sitting in the structure, the farmhouse structure, unfinished, as my father was building it
Yeah.
there on the open Karoo fields at lantern or candlelight. And my mother would read to us books about history, about politics, not specifically formal party politics, but how people had their lives in different contexts around the world, not only even just Afrikaner history or politics, but around the world. She would read to us every night, and in that context, you learn a lot. And then there's always these adult discussions about what's going on in the country. What are we experiencing? Why are we experiencing it? What is it? What is the solution? How do we live in justice to other peoples? And that was the rhythm. During the day, we would tend to our little Karooland farm. The house would be built for a while. The kids lived in a what do you call it? A caravan,
Yeah.
and my mother and father lived in a shipping container while they built the house and planted trees. And I think that's an act of planting trees it's an act of being future driven, thinking of the future. There was not even a water supply to our small farm. My father had a front loader, a laagraaf, and with which he would get a big bucket full of water in the front end, and my mother would sit with a emmer, what do you call it in English?
A bucket.
A bucket, and
I
she
must
would water
let
them.
me just interject here quickly. I know there's a lot of Afrikaners watching this now and saying, Johan, why don't you just simply speak in Afrikaans? I'm doing so because I really want more than just Afrikaans people to hear this story. So please forgive me and forgive me for the suffering that I'm putting myself through, and obviously yours a little bit as well. But yours, it is fascinating because and this is why I said to you just before we started this chat, I confess to you that I have some kind of a bit of a romantic idea about Urania. And it does appeal to me tremendously. The idea of pioneering, building something new, building a new vision. Now, when you were this young kid, mom and dad in the situation that you're sketching to us now, tell me, when do you become, or the family become, conscious? I almost want to use the word physically conscious, and I know it's not a correct description, but conscious of the fact that you are in fact building the seeds of something that you hope that will grow much bigger than just the situation in which you find yourself at that point. At which point in your life do you become conscious of this vision that you're creating here?
Yeah, the first thing I could think of is the very strange people that lived in Urania in the early days, and with that I include our family. You
Yeah.
had to be, to some extent, quite strange to choose this. My father was a medical doctor, and he had a good career outside of Urania. And he left the medical practice to move to Orania. So you had to be a little bit strange to leave such economic opportunities in order to come and settle here in the semi-desert area. I think the types of people that did that was so fueled by the Orania idea that they said some strange things. One of those that I remember is a big discussion about why do we let these national airlines fly over Orania? Orania is a little bit in the center of South Africa, so flights from Cape Town to Johannesburg and vice versa, or even some international flights, I presume, fly over Orania, and you can see the Boeings and the Airbuses and so on fly, and you see the white trails. And there was a heated discussion about why can these people just use our airspace like see fit. So that
Yeah.
was in the 90s in Urania,
Yeah.
a different time, but it
How
gives
do
this
I? I'm going to interrupt again, but I want to take. I really want to be able to get a visual image in my head, and I want to give listeners, viewers, also that visual. Give me that visual impression. You said your folks, your mom and dad, and you at some point lived in a caravan as well, or something like that. Is that what the image that I must have of Urania here, sort of somewhere in the middle of the desert, and a couple of houses around? What do I see? Sketch to
yes,
me the
absolutely.
feel of
Yeah.
Urania at that time.
Well, I must say, Urania then and Urania now is totally different places. It's
Mhm.
not almost not even comparable. The reason why is Urania is a small abandoned project of the Department of Water Affairs. So during the Anglo-Boer War, some Afrikaners identified the opportunity to make the Orange River sustainable. The Orange River, of course, named after Willem of Oranje.
Mhm.
So there's a bit of Dutch context there. I was recently in Delft where he was shot.
Yeah.
But the Orange River named to the Oranje family, and the infrastructure was developed in the 60s and 70s to make the river sustainable. Very interesting discussion given the land debate, right? Because the Karoo area is very inhospitable, almost uninhabitable without water. When the Orange River was made sustainable, permanent settlement in this area was made possible. That's not something that one should throw around lightly because it's possible to survive here nomadically, moving around. It's a tough life. It's not a very popular way of living, but it is possible. And some of the Khoisan moving around in this area very, very long ago proved that, there's possibilities. Also, the Boere moved here. We know that they crossed the Orange River during the Great Trek, and we know that during the Anglo-Boer War, there was also commandos in this area. But it's not easy to survive. But making the Orange River sustainable was the key to developing agriculture. To tell you the truth, if the Orange River project under the Verwoerd administration was completed to its entirety, it would have been possible to produce 6 million tons of wheat and maize per year in this area. About 2/3 of that is possible now, about 4 million tons. As cultivars and so on progress, it gets more. But so that's the context that was created. This town was established for the engineers and the project managers and the workers who physically built the now Van der Kloof Dam, back then the Piakala Dam. And when they abandoned Orania and the rest of the project in the 80s, the town became a ghost town. So there's a little ghost town in the Karoo area, very dry, very arid, very scarce with rainfall. And then the Orania thinkers, identify this as a possible start for this new project. Now, I must also say that the Orania project, the earliest iterations of the idea, specifically in regards to own labor, which is fundamental to what we are doing here, doing our own work rather than using what is in South Africa basically cheap black labor. Rather than exploiting anyone else for labor, we do our own work. And that's critical. From building houses to scrubbing toilets to building roads, we do everything ourselves. It's a critical element of Orania. But anyway, so that idea, the earliest iterations of that I know of is in 1952. It grows in the 70s with the Orania Werkers, and the Orania movement, then Afstig, was created in 1988. And Orania bought in 91. So they raised funds to buy this small abandoned ghost town in the Karoo. Why here? Well, it is a lowly developed area. There was very little infrastructure in the broader area with potential for development because of the open space, firstly, and also of the river, then just recently made sustainable. So farming and so on can start. And very important, no one else lived here. In general terms, in demographic terms, right? So the Northern Cape in general, but the Karoo specifically, is the most scarcely populated part of the entire country. So the fact that it is what we call a demographic hole, there aren't other people living there that you need to live in hostility towards. It's an open space, it's not inhabited, and there Orania could start. So it's the semi-desert space, and they said if Afrikaners want to survive, they must come to such a space and create a demographic majority there. So Afrikaners must be the majority. It's the only way you can make political, religious, and cultural decisions for yourselves, and that's what should be done. So Orania was then identified as a growth point for such a project, which started in 91, and a lot of people excited with this ideal and this idea. I think there was 30 families at first, and it grew to about 300 people total in the first few years.
Yeah. So it was, you used the word growth point now. It was seen by the founder, Karel Boshoff, and the people who assisted him or worked together on the project. It was seen as the starting point, the first seeds of building what would, in this dream, then eventually become an Afrikaner homeland. Am I saying it correct?
Yes. We use the word heimat. We use the word national home when we speak to more Englishly inclined countries where national homes got a bit of a more familiar term. We use older term as Volksstaat. It's got certain baggage, but doesn't mean the idea inherently is wrong or evil. We've used many different terminology, but the basic assumption is that if we want to survive as a people, a pioneering spirit needs to develop so that we settle in this arid region and become a majority here so that we can make certain decisions for ourselves.
Yeah. Am I right, Joost, if I say it's literally saying, well, this is a piece of land that nobody really wants. It's a piece of land that we can utilize for the building of this ideal homeland for the Afrikaner. Is
Absolutely. That it's well described in the early Orania literature by sociologists. Prof. Karel was a theologian of career, but also very well respected academic, as well as Dr. Chris Jooste, the sociologist who helped found this idea. So it was a very strong academic base, academic, politically philosophical base, and we built on that. But yeah, that's exactly the idea.
Back to the young Joost as you grow up. I grew up in South Africa and identify with the idea of being a South African. That was my reference or identity. You grew up in Oranje. Did you identify with South Africa as well? Was there a duality in how you identify yourself as, or did you grow up being an Oranje?
Yes, very much. And I think it's Herman Gilomee in his book, The Afrikaners, wrote the right thing that the Voortrekkers obviously didn't call themselves the Voortrekkers. The name Boere was used at some stage, but they referred to themselves as Christians. So that was their primary identity. And I hope that Iranians can do that too, although very fallible and sinful people as well. But that we can focus on that identity as well. But I think firstly, we would call ourselves, especially at that stage, but also now, our first identity would be that of Iranians. Our second one would be that of Afrikaners. And then maybe third also would be to say, yes, we are South Africans in the sense that we have South African passports and that we are citizens of South Africa and that we are in this region called South Africa. But we also see certain things in the political dispensation that would lead to our demise that we don't think of as very good. So the South Africanism, not as a region or a space, but as a political construct, is something that we were less comfortable with than, for example, being people of Oranje or people of the cultural group, the folk, the people, Afrikaners. And in that itself, it was an interesting conversation because it's nuanced. It's not that you outright reject being also part of South Africa, but it's maybe not your primary identity. Your primary identity would be in your religion, your culture, and your town, Oranje. And that's nuanced. So not being aggressive towards many of the rest of the Afrikaner people embracing the idea of South Africa, but also not fully aligning ourselves with that political dispensational construct was an interesting thing, and I think it learns people to young Iranians to think of themselves in a duality or a multi sector of identities, some closer and some a bit farther, but all part of that what makes you something.
Yeah, if we can just for one moment talk about identity. And to start this segment about identity, I'd like to take you back to the announcement by Donald Trump and the executive order that he had just recently issued, the effect that that's had on all of us. This whole discussion about identity, and I think Aaron Ritz refers to your natural identity. Do you think that in the light of what has happened in the last couple of weeks, the Trump executive order, et cetera, that there is a kind of a new focus on the concept, the idea of natural identities vis-a-vis the broader unitary state of South Africa? Is that something that you think has come more to the fore since Donald Trump's executive order?
Well, I would argue that even during his first term, leading up to his first term, so the years 2015, 2016, already the discussion of what it means to be something and where do you align yourself, and also in the past 10 or so years, what does it mean to change your identity? We see this entire debate or spectacle about changing your gender. And the pushback towards that is to say, well, there's certain things you just can't change. And then asking, obviously, should you try and change? And what good can there be in trying to change such things? So I think the entire political movement surrounding President Trump, but also broader, also in Europe and so on, a lot of identity-related discussions were had. I think the past few weeks, even more so, Afrikaners being called Afrikaners, again, something that even our own media wouldn't do for as early as 7 or 8 years ago. They would refer to Afrikaans-speaking people or things like that, rather than Afrikaners. So the renewed focus on identity, obviously very positive for us. We are people that believes in the value of identity. On the other hand, it can obviously be misused for people's personal gain and so on. But I think it's now our responsibility, our task, our responsibility in the light of this uh, unexpected, very unexpected and surprising announcement of President Trump, where he referred to Afrikaners by their name, by their volkskap almost, to say in that light, well, how do an Afrikaner act? How do we behave? How do we handle and carry ourselves? What's our relations with other people like? And so on. So that is an opportunity to prove something. Many people say they claim America is back and Americans are back. It's something that it's a sentiment that you hear a lot, specifically regarding President Trump and his supporters. And in that light, I want to say, well, the Afrikaner is also back to a certain sense. The world knew about us. And there's new light on us, and how will we go into that future? This will be the test of our time. N.P. van Wyk Louw writes about, this the loyale verset. I'm not sure where, but he writes about that living in justice, but also being true to who you are, being the identity, being truly who you are. It's important that you have that right. Karel Boshoff once said, Afrikaners must remember it's okay to be on your own side. It is okay. You don't have to try and be everything for everyone. It's fine to be someone for something specifically, and that in the Orania light is important. We are a specific group, and we are thankful for that.
30 years ago, South Africa became a democracy. I was a foreign correspondent at the time. I was one of the people here in Amsterdam that were mesmerized by all of this happening around us. Great freedom. Finally, South Africa is free from apartheid. Also, finally, the Afrikaner is liberated. It was part of the theme. A lot of people actually in Europe expressing their deep respect for the Afrikaner at the time, having given up power. I was going to use the word handing over, and I suppose it will start a whole new debate. But I was one of the people that really felt emancipated by the birth of the new South Africa. It is now 30 years later. Part of the birth of the new South Africa was the birth of the so-called multiracial, multicultural democracy, an ideal that was very, very much powerful and in the minds of people, especially here in Europe during the 90s. That would also, that creation of that multiracial, ethnic, multicultural society will also actually mean destroying the other identities. Now we are here 30 years later, back again to Trump's executive order. You just used the words, the Afrikaner is back. What does that say about the multicultural, multiracial ideal in South Africa? And I'm asking this question also in the context of a discussion I've had recently with a group of South African Afrikaner journalists who told me it's very much alive and well. And I somehow sit here, and from where I sit, it seems to be, to me, that the multicultural idea has dissipated. It doesn't really exist anymore in South Africa, that there's a reassertion of the identity as you've just expressed it right now. In your view, what is happening right now in your view?
It's a great question. There's a lot of things that immediately rush to the forefront of my thoughts. I think the first thing I want to say is, who is it that said, for the nation to live, the tribe must die? That's some African leader saying, for the nation to live, the tribe must die. And I would like to speak for hours about this theme. It's very close to the heart, because I disagree, but also because the nation state, which is a fairly new construct of how both nations and states handle themselves. The nation state is not a very old concept, and it is seemingly not a very successful concept either. So the nation state have set certain prerequisites, requirements for people and states to operate in. And in this, the idea also came to Africa to say that tribes, the different tribes, all different cultures must die and be dissolved into this new idea, the nation state with a unitary nation in it. However, that unitary new nation being extremely diverse, they must all accept a new identity. And it saddens me to think that there's people expecting the Afrikaner culture to die and to become only brandewyn, rugby, and braai. Brandy, rugby, and having a barbecue as a new identity. That's not identity. And as for the other peoples of South Africa and of Africa, the same. To take away many, many, many years of culture and to replace it with South Africanism is fatal. And there is no diversity in requiring that. The claim that diversity is strength and the claim that, South Africa is a rainbow nation implies diversity. It implies different peoples with different beliefs and different cultures and different outlooks on life. And to take that all away and to say we must become South Africans, a new singular identity in which the tribes and the cultures died so that the nation can live is frightening for me. It's not a good thing. I think that is the one aspect, the combination of how the nation state is viewed in modern politics, how nations is viewed, how cultures and tribes is viewed as primitive and should be left in the dust of history. The end of history, that idea that liberalism and democracy will just manifest all over the world, and history is now ended because the human race has progressed to this epitome of existence. It's just blatantly false. And it's Western centric to an extent where the West is suiciding itself with it, but also dismantling culture around the world, and that includes the Afrikaner to a certain extent. So I believe for the people, for the cultures to live, the tribe must also live. And that brings a lot of the new frame of reference in thinking. New words must be almost created to help give life to these kinds of thinking, and a total shift in paradigm. And that means de-evolution of power from the ground up. So the change in South Africa, the so-called New South Africa, and the euphoria that it brought with it. It's not the first time. When the English took control of the Cape, they used the word new as well, and they told people embrace this new system. And when the Union of South Africa was created in 1999, 10, and 11, with all the changes that came with it, they said this is a new South Africa. And in 1994, again, a new South Africa. But is it really so new if it's the same concept? First, it was the British who ruled South Africa as a unitary country. Then came the Afrikaner. Then came the ANC. Who can say that they were successful? And I don't mean service delivery. I mean as a way that people can continue living forward in justice. Who can claim that this South African empire was ruled in justice to all? I don't think anyone can. Worst of all, maybe the ANC. And for that reason, I believe it's necessary for the tribe to live from de-evolution of power and for peoples to take control of their own future. And not be centrally managed to the extent where it is a total, in my opinion, a total disaster. So I think the problem is inherent. It's not only bad rulers, it is the idea of being ruled. Our Orania definition of freedom is to say we don't want to be ruled by anyone else, but we also do not want to rule over others. We have no such ambitions. And that will truly be a new South Africa. I don't like the term New South Africa because it's got a specific political context, but let's just say another South Africa. And that's what we would like to imagine as Oranians.
Yeah. Help me to try to understand it. What's going on in South Africa right now, because I'm 12,000 kilometers away from South Africa, and the first thing I get to hear from people is, well, you're not here, you don't understand what's going on in the country. But I'm confronted with one group of people that seems to be the predominant group in South Africa. At least they've got the media in hand. And then I referred to my friends, the journalists who recently came to Amsterdam, who told me that their lived experience of this thing which we call the new South Africa, the multicultural, multiracial melting pot, their lived experience is a positive one, that they identify of that. My question to you actually is, if what you say has any value, why are we not discussing this as the uppermost, most important theme in our newspapers, in our media today? Why is this not the discussion at the moment? Because I've been told that I'm crazy for just simply questioning the success of the multicultural, multiracial new South Africa.
Yes. Well, I think one of the reasons the people who have the media in their hands have very little ambitions for such change. Secondly, the people with the political power in their hands have very little ambitions for such change. And the people with the economic power have very little ambitions for such change. So from who do you hear? It's mostly one of those three groups. The people on the ground live in poverty. They live in crime, they live in corruption, they feel the effects of that. We see 80 murders per day on average in South Africa. We see 150 rapes every day on average in South Africa. We see massive corruption, we see rolling blackouts. I can continue to list the negative and very sad things that's happening in this country, but that will not bring us closer to a solution. I think one of the reasons is that, well, a luxurious, fantastic life can still be bought in South Africa. It can, it's possible. It's possible to buy a place, a spot in an estate, which differs very little from the exclusion zones of apartheid. It differs only that the focus went from race towards commercial success. You can now buy your place in a multi-walled estate where you go through 3 security checks just to get in, whether that be by fingerprint or by some kind of identity card, or you could call it a passbook, maybe, if you want to. But it's a sign of commercial success, taking you in there, and there you live, and the people from the townships only come in to scrub your toilet or tend to your garden. But you live a good lifestyle. Why would you complain? You make a lot of money. There's still a lot of economic success in South Africa. So why would you then go out of that area of comfort and criticize from your ivory tower the situation in South Africa? You just pray that while you're on the highway on your way to work or holiday, that you don't get hijacked or murdered or so. But for the rest of the time, you're relatively safe behind 3 walls. 2 exterior walls and 1 around your property with dogs and armed security guards ready to react. So for a lot of people's life in South Africa, very comfortable still. But then you've got the most people in South Africa living in poverty, and that includes Afrikaners living in squatter camps more and more so as the economy fails, and BEE and other 142 laws based on race, more than the height of apartheid, pushes them out of the economy, universities, and more. That excludes the fact that Afrikaners as a people have no communal land, which they can call their own, no communal place, no heimat, no home that they can call theirs. So it depends really on who you are, how you experience South Africa. It's easy to sit in an ivory tower and to say life is just splendid, whether that be my little holiday in Plettenberg Bay or Hartenbos, or my a multi-story office building away from the real life on ground level, or that be safe in my bed in a high level security estate.
Yeah. 30 years post-apartheid South Africa, I've asked this question to a number of people, both on the left and the right spectrum of South African politics. 30 years post-apartheid, have we been successful or not successful in creating a national identity? I suspect I know what your answer is, but I'd like to hear it.
Well, my first reaction would be to say no, because I cannot say what that national identity is. I cannot think of a single attribute that applies to almost all, at least, who lives in South Africa. I think the successes of creating a national identity to a certain extent, some of which are quite sad to me because it denies people their cultural and religious and folks' identities, the successes would much rather lay in something like the Springbok rugby team or Driekus du Plessis and so on. So a lot around sport and maybe a little bit about social things like barbecue and so on. I don't see depth in the little bit of national identity that South Africans have. I see much more depth in cultural, folks, and religious identities that people still house. And as an Iranian, while I have appreciation for certain things that happens in South Africa, I would much rather prioritize my own identity, although it doesn't stand antagonistic against others. It's mine, and it's the identity of my people, and for that it is important for me. It doesn't mean that we cannot enjoy other things that also happen in South Africa, but we cannot claim it as ours. We cannot claim a single part of that identity as only ours. And I think many Afrikaners are still used to it. The Springbok team were just theirs, or the political system or so. Now the political system is completely out of the hand of Afrikaners and they can't claim it. So I don't think there's a single attribute that applies to all South Africans. Actually, I'm not really sure, except for the fact that they live in South Africa, what it means to be a South African.
Yeah. It's fascinating. What you're saying at the same time to me, and I'm now a little bit cynical, and we'll try to say this with a sense of humor. It will appear to me, looking from the outside, that you guys there in Oranje, who've been told for many, many years that you are the backwards Afrikaners that are trying to go back and restore a form of apartheid, it seems to me might be part of the solution of the future of South Africa, or an idea might be part of the solution of the future of South Africa.
So I hope so. That would be very good for us. It'd be very good. It would be, a fantastic thing. But and we are liaising with other communities in South Africa who asks for solutions. And I hope we can do it in justice and do it in the right way and continue to be even if it's just a hope for conservative communities around the world, but also other communities in South Africa. I don't think we are backwards. I think we are very much rooted in our identity, but we are progressive in our thinking. Conservative in our identity, but progressive in our thinking.
No, and I hope you don't think that I'm thinking that you're backwards. What I'm trying to say is that there were times certainly in which people that moved to Oranje were being frowned upon, and it was seen as this backward group of people that are sort of yearning for the old apartheid South Africa, and largely dismissed by society. And I'm suggesting to you that that has changed in the meantime. I also do think that people are looking through different eyes now towards projects like Oranje. The question, though, is how does one unpack all of this, or how do you undo a process of, and you can't use the word 300 years of integration, but we have kind of mixed and mashed everything together over the last 200 years of our history, at least. And how do you create spaces geographically, or in which way do you create that where people can find a space to live out their particular identity? How do you undo that which is really started with the Union of South Africa?
That's a good question. I think the first step is it must be voluntary. Give people the opportunity to voluntarily associate where they want to. They are entangled, they are enchained by so much legal things pushed down on them, whether that be BEE, racial laws, racial requirements, and things like that. So give people the opportunity to freely find their own spaces and make their own choices, which is very important. Secondly, I would say give content into culture, give the opportunity for cultures to develop content for who they are. We always say in Oranje, we must define ourselves as unique as possible, as often as possible, because that gives you the option, the right, and the reality to live out more self-determination. So that's quite important as well. We are pushed into the South Africa by the pro-British colonialist South African Party of 1910. But it's unnatural, it's artificial, it's artificial, and people, as Adams would put it, go back to their natural identities. And I think this is the time of the rise of natural identities. The Oranje light, hopefully, in changing political climate, could also be a torch to say, how do we do this in justice? Well, and I think the first step of doing it in justice is to do it voluntarily, and maybe to do it a bit slowly sometimes, not to rush things, but to Orania is in a certain sense a very extreme solution. Own labor is something that Afrikaners don't know about. It's unknown to them, and it's extreme to manifest this own labor policy. It's Afrikaners and many other people around the world don't. It's not normal for them. They have cheap labor available. So that's radical in that sense, but it's not radical in the way that it manifests. It's not radical in the way that we choose to build here, uh, um, uh, to lay out a road here, to build something that others can follow here. It's not radical in opposition. It's radical rather to the requirements we set for ourselves. So it's simultaneously conservatively slow moving and radical and new. And I hope that can play a role in undoing the uh, the structures, the top-down, forced-down structures.
Do you think it's the idea of Irania that brings so much focus? And then I talk about the negative focus and pressure from the Economic Freedom Front, and we've now seen from many circles within a government the negative focus. Do you think it's the idea of Irania that is threatening to the ruling class?
Maybe. The idea, the self-sufficiency as we build out our energy infrastructure now, being in control of more than 50% of our own energy, hopefully soon more. The fact that we have created structure so that we don't have load shedding here in Orania, the rolling blackouts that the national energy provider must manifest, must facilitate in order to have enough energy to provide. Maybe it is in terms of the cultural focus. Maybe it's in terms of the fact that we already have the political, shall I say, victory where we can keep our own local municipal taxes and levies, though our tax money in terms of income tax, company tax, and more still flows out of our community. So those are all reasons that I think it doesn't sit comfortable with someone who wants to sit centrally and take tax money from everyone while telling them how they must live their lives. A typical centralist empire view of politics. It doesn't sit well with them if small communities start growing and get support from maybe some unexpected people as well. And when even black communities in South Africa, traditional communities, start asking, okay, how does this Orania model work now? It's interesting. Maybe that is one of the reasons why the political institutions of South Africa organize against Orania.
You've just been to the United States of America as well, if I understand it correctly. I read in the press. I think that in the newspapers it was written that you were there to ask for support to get more autonomy or to get your autonomy, your independence, I think is another word to describe. At the same time, when I did a little bit of research on Orania, I read about in 2023, I think you got together at a kind of a meeting in Pretoria in which you envisioned the development of a big city where Orania is currently, and I wrote it down somewhere, a city that would accommodate eventually 1 million people. There's a pretty ambitious plans, and I would imagine government is aware of that. Um, does that not justify from the enemies, the empire's point of view, why you would be put under pressure? I'm trying to phrase it as politely as what I can now.
No, I understand. No, I think maybe it would. But the fact is, the great advantage that we have is we don't hurt anyone, we don't do anyone economic harm, we don't deny anyone their rights to exist, we don't forcefully remove anyone. And in the fact that Orania is living and building in justice, in moral justice, in the fact that we're not exploiting anyone, and in the fact that we are not some kind of underground movement. We clearly organize publicly and tell people what we are doing. It's no underground movement with sinister ideals, while simultaneously both leaving the option for people to stay wherever they want to stay in the rest of South Africa, or for Afrikaners, or to come join us as a voluntary act. leaves this in the realm of the legal and the moral. And added to that is the ANC's own words by the mouth of Wally Musa at that stage in the Mandela Parliament, still where he said, made the public declaration, and this is still very searchable and publicly available. The pursuit for Afrikaner self-determination in this corridor of the country is a legitimate pursuit. Added to that is Article 235 of the South African Constitution granting us this right to build. So it's legal, it's public, and we are not in favor of doing anyone damage that's not damaging us and denying us our rights to existence. So it's really tough for anyone from the empire or from any political party to say, well, there's a specific point where Orania is doing wrong or something illegal, because we simply aren't. And hopefully that is enough.
Yeah, I really fully understand your approach, and I would call it soft approach, if I could give it a term. But it seems to me that at the end of the day, it's almost impossible to avoid a potential clash between, let's call it then, the empire and against this new idea. And when the idea is expressed through building a city that could finally accommodate, whether it will take 10 years or 20 years or 50 years, 1 million people with a particular identity. It's the clash of ideas that I'm talking about, which makes it something volatile.
Yeah, I think it is volatile. South Africa is volatile to an extent. We are trying to construct in such a way that we heightened and deepened understanding for the Orania idea, but also try to act in good faith as far as possible and so on. But yes, I think the thing is there are so many other communities, black communities in South Africa, interested in the Orania idea, that the ruling party will have a very tough time to also deny them their rights of cultural existence. And what's more is, the perspective of the empire is not only Orania, they have other focuses as well. But the sad story is due to sheer incompetence and less of shared values, less and less of shared culture, and less of shared national identity, as well as the incompetence in service delivery and other things, the empire is deteriorating. The empire is slowly deteriorating.
Yeah.
And the fact that it's slowly falling apart, well, it's good that it's happening slowly. A sudden deterioration might have been fatal for many people in bad ways in terms of hunger.
But it's happening. It's happening. The fact is that it's happening. The state is collapsing. The country, viewed from the outside, is in a mess. We look at the crime statistics, look at the massive corruption. It seems to me that we are moving South Africa towards a point in which it will become inevitable choices will have to be made.
Yes. I think that is every day, and during the 90s, there was this phrase of, the Nag van die Lang Messe, the night of the long knives, and there's going to be a, attack on Afrikaner people and so on. And the message around here is also in a safety and security sense is saying, with the crime in South Africa, every night is that night. The problem of many people is they are waiting for some kind of big collapse before they start doing something. Build your future. If you're concerned about the future, build it. Don't wait for some big event, some cataclysmic event destroying everything and then think you'll build a solution from that. No, you must build every day, because the security onslaught is every night. In the same sense, the political onslaught is every day. It's not some big event that's going to happen. Maybe it will come to a screeching halt one day and it will have big implications, but it's every day. And to counter that in terms of having a future, one must build every day. And that is very, very tough. It's much tougher starting Orania in the 90s, the early 90s, or manifesting the Orania idea in the 80s, where for many Afrikaners, apartheid was still a comfortable option. It was very tough building Orania in the early 2000s, around 2010, when the South African economy was actually doing well. South African economy grew under the Mbeki administration. It is very tough, continue building when it feels like it's going well, like when the Springboks win the World Cup and everybody thinks, no, South Africa is actually not such a bad place. Forget about load shedding and crime and so on. But one must build every day if one wants to counter the deterioration that happens every day. And I think the empire is falling apart. One of our intellectuals said, in the void left by the absence of the empire is two options. It is either under management of warlords, which might be gangs, criminals, or syndicates, or whatever, or under the rule of communities, which is stability, instability, and stability. And one can only choose early and proactive to be part of a constructing and constructive community than to wait for the criminals and the warlords to take over your area.
Yeah.
And that is maybe the only options that there are.
Yeah, we're running out of time here, Joost. It's fascinating to talk to you. I want to ask you to confirm or not confirm to me my observation from here that we have reached the point where we are moving towards closer and closer this clashing of ideas in South Africa, and that the two poles would be one side, the multicultural, multiracial, multi-ethnic, ideal rainbow nation, and on the other side, the assertion of the natural identity idea that Ernst Ritz is talking about. Am I correct, just observing from outside, that that is what's playing itself out in South Africa, that that is the core struggle in South Africa today as we're sitting here?
Well, I think yes, but I would add an addendum to that, and that would be to say many people might feel inclined to choose as their natural identities a multiracial, multicultural, metropolitan kind of future. That should be their right to choose as such. I'm not here to tell them they don't have that right. But I would say that the contrast between the centralistic empire and the localized community might be the clash of ideas. Many Afrikaners, many South Africans of different races, religions, creeds, and cultures would choose to live in a metropolitan area where that continues. And maybe they even want to have a certain independent space in current South Africa where they want to continue with that. That should be their fullest right. What I'm saying is that we as Afrikaners would choose our identity, well, the Afrikaners of Orania would choose our identity as Afrikaners here. And the clash then is a clash of ideas in terms of empire and centrally managed national identity versus locally managed natural identity, community focused. And that is the two poles, my opinion. So the empire doesn't like communities because of tax reasons, because of logistics, because people who don't necessarily incline themselves with the artificial national identity, they are not the best citizens in terms of just doing what is expected of them by the national government and so on. So it's empire versus community, and that is what I think.
And I think in the first phase, am I right if I say the first natural thing would be devolution of power, would be the first possible evolutionary thing?
Well, we already see it. Professor Koos Malan published phenomenal works where the Constitution of South Africa says one thing, but the reality in South Africa is another. The Constitution clearly states that the only right or the only protectors of the national integrity as well as public order and crime fighting is the police. Well, if you take private security in South Africa, you take the army and the police, you double the army and police's numbers, and you add it together, and that is then only is it as big as private security. Private security do the work in real time and real terms, meaning that there's already a certain devolution of power. We already see that certain communities take responsibility for water, electricity, and basic service delivery. That's already a practical devolution of power. The Constitution of South Africa speaks about one South Africa, one way the right to clean drinking water and the right to human dignity and housing is guaranteed and safety is guaranteed. But who's guaranteeing it? No one is guaranteeing it. It's already deteriorating. No safety can be guaranteed for certain people. No housing can be on clean drinking water. It must be guaranteed by yourself if you want it. And that is a natural de-evolution of power in real terms. Whether it's recognized or not, it's real. If you can have zero political recognition, then there's other communities in South Africa where they are fully dependent on themselves in terms of water supply or political decision making. It's just no one knows of this because it is very local and just natural. So the evolution of power it is political, but it's also practical.
Yeah. It's going to be my last question. I think we are way over time anyway. I want to just talk for a moment about human beings in the midst of all of this that we're talking about, mothers and fathers and children and grandfathers and grandmothers, people. The lived experience of the people of Orania. It must have an effect on the community, the constant threat, the constant drumming of beats, the banging. How does it affect ordinary people? And how do you as a small community, because you are only 3,000 strong at this point, how do you deal with this enormous, from my point of view, pressure that's on you on a daily basis?
Oh, yeah. It's not always easy. Having constant threats on social media, on public media, people saying, we shouldn't have the right to exist, the EFF marching against and say Orania must fall, hearing people like Julius Malema slit the throat of whiteness, things like this is concerning. I hope in a certain sense the people of Orania have experienced so many times that they've learned certain mechanisms to just continue through it and continue building and continue creating the future. But it is concerning, especially when people who survived farm attacks, or many people live in Orania who lost their parents or their brothers or their sisters to very gruesome farm attacks. And now they live here, and people publicly stating things like that reignite something that they know. Maybe they have seen a parent or a child or a friend or a brother's with a slit throat on a farm attack, and now people make these statements. I think it's horrific for them to re-experience this in a political manner. It is bad, but the other option is always, what else? What else is sustainable? Where can I put my energy in where it will be sustainable, where it would be to something with a greater and long-term value? And that's exactly why I think we don't want to be refugees in the United States. It is a short-term solution. Well, some people obviously wants to go in South Africa, Afrikaners, but the people of Orania primarily do not want to go because they want to build something that will survive, something long-term. And if we can keep our focus there, the families, the mothers, the fathers, the grandfathers and the small children and so on, like have something to focus their efforts on, which is not fleeting, but sustainable.
Joost Strydom, Chief Executive Officer, Orania Beweging, thank you very, very much for this discussion.
Thank you. I enjoyed it. Thank you very much for the opportunity.